Welcome everyone, we are back for day 4. This is a full stream we've done on the Ukrainian war, right from the beginning, and I think it's day 4 now. So I said I was going to do a stream every evening UK time, so not as long as the ones we've done before, but a couple of hours. That's what. Welcome along everyone, that's what we'll do. Seffi, can you explain what's on your screen? So yeah, this is live UA map, which has some level of verification and is a running update of the latest events in Ukraine. And this is Flight Radar 24. This stream at the moment here is Ukraine live camera. I really wanted the Taiwanese camera we had yesterday, but that just went down. But this is the same location. You can just make out the cathedral here. But again, if anyone thinks this camera isn't live, then please let me know. The two cameras we had yesterday were live, as we saw the sun come up. We're looking at Japanese news as well. I don't have a camera from Japanese news. Let me check Fox News. Bear with me. It's Fox Business, that won't be it. So I don't think we have the Fox News cam either. Again, there might be some sort of blackout at night. We seemed to see that yesterday from the Western outlets. Welcome everyone. Yeah, the YouTube algorithm is just going to be massively confused. We've just done some sim racing and now we're back on the map. So I think what's been really interesting is it seems to be more apparent that the Russians haven't been able to overtake these big cities like Kyiv, second biggest city in Ukraine, over 1 million residents, Sumy as well, Kherson in the south here, Donetsk as well, haven't got near Dnipro. And it seems like what they're doing is, this actually isn't the best map. I've seen some better maps. Bear with me. It seems to be that the Russians have tried to get into these cities, although some of the invasions we've seen have been a little bit strange. And it's what they're doing now is they're basically just progressing onto Kyiv. And not only are these cities going to be encircled, like Konotop already looks to be encircled, Kharkiv looks like it's going to be encircled as well, but actually there might be pockets of Ukrainian forces that are going to be cut off. So for example, if there's Ukrainian forces here and these columns can meet together and it looks like they're going to bypass Chernihiv as well, then you're going to have cut off parts of the Ukrainian army, which is obviously that would be a big win for Russia. Bear with me a second. Yeah, so there was the statement today from Putin. I said I was surprised yesterday I hadn't heard a statement from Putin, but there was a statement from Putin today saying that, you know, increasing the readiness of the nuclear deterrence. Again, I wouldn't be too worried about that if you're sat home in a country that has nuclear weapons or if you're part of NATO. And I can't foresee, and this is the kind of weird thing, and we've spoken a lot about MAD and NATO and UNSC resolutions, but I can't reasonably foresee any situation in which Russia would want to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. That would go against the whole ethos of liberating Ukraine. But these are the things where things can kind of spiral out of control, and we saw that with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I'm not sure there are the diplomatic links at the moment to really climb down from that. But obviously it was a big statement. A lot of the major news outlets are running with that because it tends to hit home a bit further. We've been speaking about it for about 3-4 days now. There is this kind of uncomfortable logic that NATO has basically said, look, this is the border that we care about, and if anything goes on outside those borders, we're not going to intervene. And I also can't see why Russia would want to use any sort of smaller tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine doesn't seem like they've really used the full strength of their conventional arsenal yet anyway. But I feel like any use is, again, it's mutually assured destruction relies on rational behavior. Like, no rational country with nuclear weapons would engage in a nuclear war with another nuclear equipped enemy. But because there seems to be some kind of irrational or illogical behavior going on, does that kind of undermine mutually assured destruction as a logical way of preventing World War III? So definitely Russia could have flattened, obviously that's not the objective. Yeah, there's many steps they could go in terms of escalating. So I wouldn't necessarily read too much into that statement, although I think it has been probably the biggest news of today. Can't see the US drone out on the Black Sea today. It might still be there with transponder off. It was interesting that it had its transponder on. It was a very public statement in a way to have a aircraft there with a transponder on, military aircraft. Welcome everyone. Katie, but there's no real end game. He can't change the regime of a country and control the millions of people. Experts seem extremely concerned. None of this is rational, it's principle. I think definitely on these streams we tried to apply kind of rational and logical frameworks to explain behavior, but there might be other things at play in terms of legacy and where does Putin want to stand in terms of previous Soviet leaders. There's so much. The situation is way beyond careful calculation now. So much stuff can happen and go out of control. And what I don't understand is it seems to be that the Russians haven't really taken any major cities, although there was some news recently that some small cities have been captured by the Russians. But in any event, you would imagine they would have expected to sweep across, especially in the east, and capture major cities because the local population they thought would have been less resistive. And the fact that hasn't happened, I don't know if it's not important because they'll just sweep past anyway and then they'll besiege these cities. MBRC, thermobaric explosions, UN emergency meeting, Putin action speech, shutting Russian aircraft from EU. Yeah, shutting the Russian aircraft. Well, I can see all the tit for tat stuff, but this is again, I think how Putin messaged it was a retaliation against NATO. So again, it comes down to this thing that NATO is seen as a defensive alliance in the West, and it seems, on balance, seems to be acting defensively, but the wording coming out of Russia is that these are not defensive actions to them. No worries, Rebel. Kieran, Russian army is just to demoralise, be lied to. I have seen reports like that. Again, I don't know how much of it is kind of counter information or however you want to put it to moralised Ukrainian troops, but it would make sense if you think, okay, the enemy is not that into this war. We did get confirmation today, unfortunately, that the Antonov AN-225 that we speculated on the first day might have been destroyed. Unfortunately was destroyed in the battles at this airport, and that was a unique plane, only one like it in the world. I think the tonnage it could carry was significantly higher than the next biggest plane in the world, which I think it might be an Airbus. Obviously it's only a plane, but I think it's quite symbolic. Brave, when are the peace talks going ahead? So yeah, a few days ago talks were proposed in Minsk and they weren't accepted purportedly by Ukraine, but it seems like they are going to go ahead in Belarus, which seems pretty extraordinary given that today there were reports that 2 missiles were launched from Belarus. Why there aren't more sanctions against Belarus, I don't know, because they seem to have played a very key part in this war. Again, if the Russian army wasn't able to advance from Belarus and construct these supply lines on its armour columns, it would be a very different war. Be a very different war. So flat out, why does this war seem aimless? I don't know. I kind of see what you're saying, because I feel like it's hard. It seems hard in the West to really understand the rationale behind it. But we're living in it, so we don't know if it is all going to plan. And it was understood it would be a very difficult war, and on the balance, the Russian government felt like that was still worth it. Oh, is it? Do keep that chat. Do keep that chat civil though, because otherwise we lose this space. Let me refresh my sources. What we'll see tomorrow, when all the markets open and the weekend ends, we'll see some effect of the Russian sanctions. We may see more protests in Russia. We'll see how much it affects people. A lot of Russia is very rural. Like a lot of these countries, you have the cities, but then you have these big rural areas that might not be that affected by the sanctions immediately, but in the cities, we'll see what effect it has. Southgate, I'm seeing an accelerated push from countries to have Russians banned from supporting events across the board. This may be start of cutting off Russia. I think it is Russia has rejected kind of playing by the international rulebook, and I think it's now it may be difficult to understand that Russia is now not part of the international scene in terms of football and sporting events. It has decided to cut itself off there, or understood the risk it would be cut off. There's a lot of questioning about whether Russia would have really expected the unitedness of the West to stand behind Ukraine. I'm sure that would have been at least on the spectrum of possible responses from the West. So a lot of the images I think we've seen today seems to be about these armour columns extending, and it seems almost certain that it's going to be a siege of Kyiv. Incredibly, we saw or heard about Russian fighting on the streets of Kyiv down this boulevard 2 nights ago, and then we didn't hear too much yesterday apart from the oil refinery or oil depot far here near this airbase. Let me see if I can find... I want to see if... Let me know if, by the way, if any of those streams come back on. Okay, Fox News one is back on, actually. So this is the same one as the Fox News stream. This is the cathedral. So I believe this is reputable. I never really identify where this roundabout is, actually. Bear with me. Enrique, the media narrative makes no sense every day. The map's not matching the reports. There is no defensive line. I think it's hard to tell. It seems unusual that... It seems maybe hard to reason how the advances have gone beyond the cities, but you can understand how the cities hold out. And this is not a war where Russia would want to level anything. The idea was, especially in the east, in the Donbass, Luhansk, etc., that they would, be welcomed into these cities because they were liberating these people from their oppressors. And if that hasn't happened, and there is quite a significant civilian resistance to that, then that strategy doesn't really work. So it seems like they're having to bypass the cities, and essentially they want to cut the cities off. And I don't know how they're going to square that domestically. Yesterday I was watching Russian state TV from time to time and how they were reporting, particularly in this area. I think today the EU Commission banned Russian state media from the West, which some would say was a long time coming. It was always interesting watching those broadcasts, especially the English language ones. They would often employ people from the UK to be anchors and reporters, and it was interesting because you felt like you were really looking in their eyes when the anchors would report on stuff that didn't seem totally accurate from what you could see from the videos themselves. Looking into their eyes and think, how much have you been paid to say this? So those TV channels, I understand, have been now banned from Europe. Zapran, who here thinks Russia will use their nuclear power? I think it's very unlikely. I think it's just standard saber rattling in terms of, talking about the readiness of the nuclear deterrent. Wait, RT is no more state media than the BBC's capital media. I think I'm biased because I'm in London, but I think I would disagree with that. But it's almost it's hard for someone to see it in the middle. You either see it one way or the other. Yeah, it was a threat, but it is also a reminder that we live in this paradox where the reason why there isn't meant to be World War III is because both Russia and America have nuclear weapons. So they have weapons that could destroy the world, but because of that, there is no World War III, and there is a kind of tension there in that equation. I didn't see the emergency meeting, no. So yeah, anyone saying, do you think there'll be nuclear weapons used? I don't think so. There's lots more levels of escalation that Russia could do. I think it wouldn't be that surprising maybe to say that it seems like some of the initial troops they sent in haven't been the most qualified, haven't been in the most up-to-date equipment, and whether that's because they're using these lesser equipped troops to kind of soften or they're throwing them in first, and then once Ukraine have lost some of their effectiveness. I still don't know what the position is on air superiority. I did see some footage today that was widely reported as a Ukrainian UAV destroying a Russian armor column, and I understand those UAVs have been developed by Turkey and have been used in a number of recent wars. I think Ukraine have a single-digit number of them, but they had 40 on order from Turkey. Turkey also issued some kind of statement saying that because they're declaring this a war, they can close the Bosphorus to some Russian ships. Again, there's a very old treaty that dictates what Turkey can and cannot do with the Bosphorus. Does anyone know, by the way, if this has been officially declared a war in terms of dotting the I's and crossing the T's? The Bear, Russia just thought their best regulars to win. There is a part of me that is increasingly thinking maybe there wasn't that freedom up the Russian chain of command to accurately report the effectiveness of the Russian troops and military, and also the willingness of Ukrainian citizens to accept Russian troops in. And if there was a miscalculation on both of those that wasn't reported up because it would be risky as an individual to report that up, it would be seen as unpatriotic, then that might explain what we're seeing at the moment. The EU airspace that's blocked off to Russia, it's been increasing all the time, but it's basically the entire EU now. I think Portugal was the last state to implement it, possibly because it was just a Sunday and there were some administrative things, but basically all of the EU now is closed to Russian aircraft. That's a private jet. We can possibly track any Russian jets that take off from Kaliningrad and see where they go. So it definitely feels less on edge than I think we were right at the beginning of the war. But there has been some extraordinary footage coming out today. There's obviously lots of footage about Russian armor columns being destroyed. We don't see a lot the other way. You'd imagine that there's losses on both sides like that. But from an information perspective and what I can perceive in the West, it seems like very much Ukraine is winning that. It seems like there's lots more reporters embedded with Ukrainian troops, whereas I haven't seen the footage I saw on Russian state media seemed to be very low key. Didn't seem to be anywhere near the front line. Hey, Ruby, I've seen videos about the last 2 days about many Russian troops being very confused about location. Again, that is good news for Ukrainian, in terms of morale. It's good news for Ukrainian citizens and soldiers to hear that the Russians are coming in and very unprepared. So take it with a grain of salt. And a lot of these I'm only reading them through subtitles. But it does seem to be that, especially when we saw the attempted takeover of this airport here, northwest of Kyiv, on the first day of the war, seemed to be not amateurish, but didn't seem to be that sharp. And there have been lots of reports and videos about Russian soldiers going into petrol stations trying to refuel, looting shops for food. It seems very strange. So that seems very strange, but I just don't know. There could be a huge miscalculation here by Russia. The danger of that is that they still have significant army to deploy in, and they have a numerical advantage, and surely it's only a matter of time before they have total air supremacy, because they can keep destroying Russian airfields, whereas Ukraine doesn't have that ability to retaliate on... Sorry, they can keep destroying Ukrainian airfields, but Ukraine doesn't have that ability to retaliate back on Russian soil. I saw a video about a purported thermobaric weapon. I saw there was a big shockwave, but I don't know enough about... I know thermobaric weapons, the ordnance is exposed in different ways, so it sucks in oxygen to fuel that explosion, but I don't know too much about it to know whether that was a thermobaric one or not. I don't think thermobaric weapons are also against the Geneva Convention in terms of biological and chemical weapons either, but I don't know for sure. Big B, Putin is a man that I imagine doesn't like to lose in anywhere, even look that way. I worry because that they didn't just mow over post. So I lost track of your comment, but I do agree that if you live in if the government is structured in a way that the leader is pretty much unquestionable, you know, it's probably good to be questioned and be told, well, hang on, what if our troops aren't as good as we think? What if the Ukrainians actually, you know, are much more resistant than we think? And if there's less of a culture of that and more of a culture of yes people, then I can see how there would have been a miscalculation here. I was certainly expecting Russians to be able to impose air supremacy very, very quickly. But again, it's very early days. This map here is not the same as other maps that I've seen, although they're all speculative in some way or another. But it seems as though Russia is kind of moving on from these cities, encircling them, so these cities won't be able to get any more supplies. They can be choked, and Russia is building these supply lines to kind of support the armor columns, because the armor columns need fuel, they need supplies, they need reserves. And a big danger in reality is that Ukrainian troops could be cut off. If you have Ukrainian troops here and Russia is able to kind of link up armor columns here, you essentially cut off Ukrainian pockets. And that's you know how Blitzkrieg worked in the Second World War. You'd punch through very quick line and split off troops on either side, and you'd cut off the enemy troops behind the point of the armor column. So if you imagine this as kind of a Blitzkrieg line, as it progresses at the point, Russia will be splitting off troops either side and cutting off the Ukrainians behind them. But again, I don't know, I'm not an expert, but you can see that potentially happening. Yeah, Belarus has been a very weird one today, because I read reports that, if I remember, I read reports chronologically that Ukraine said they weren't going to engage in discussions with Belarus because Belarus was supporting Russia in the war. Then I think I'm very tired. So then I think Ukraine said they would engage in those talks in Belarus, near the border, somewhere around here near Chernobyl. And as a result, and in exchange for that, Belarus agreed that all Russian troops on its borders wouldn't be sent over the border, wouldn't be sent airborne. But then shortly after that, I heard reports of 2 missiles being launched from Belarus, and there was video footage of that. So it seemed like a very, very weird one. Again, we've spoken a lot about what could have been done to prevent this war, especially in the late days, potentially enforcing a no-fly zone at Ukraine's request in terms of what NATO could have done, putting some NATO troops on the ground as a deterrent to Russia, because of what could escalate because of that. I think another one would have been applying significant pressure to Belarus, because if Belarus hadn't facilitated Russian troops going in through its territory, it would be a very, very different war. It feels like Ukraine would be fighting a front that possibly would be, you know, sort of retreating back to Kyiv, but instead they're now being encircled, and I think there was more fighting at Test State. It seems pretty clear that what Russia want to do is kind of encircle Kyiv this way, and you imagine that Dnipro is going to come under intense pressure, progress back up the river. Yeah, I did. So I saw that report from Russian State TV. I haven't seen it, but the comment that why do we need the world if Russia won't be in it is a really striking comment, and it's one of these things about sanctions and excluding countries. If you sanction and exclude countries, you give them less of an incentive to play by the international rulebook. We've seen that with North Korea, and we've seen it with Iran. And so that statement of why does Russia need the world? Why does Russia need the world if Russia won't be in it is quite striking. Yeah, the markets will open tomorrow. Obviously, there's like before market trading and indications, and FX trading continues. But by all accounts, there's going to be a bloodbath in the markets tomorrow. And you would think to some extent that's been priced in by the government. But we don't know. Welcome, Callum. Fear, is the thinking it's quiet tonight because they're waiting negotiations in the morning? Again, I'm not sure it is quiet tonight. It definitely feels quieter in Kyiv, but the biggest fighting, I think, will have been in the cities. It sounds like there was huge. In fact, it looked like there was a flash there. It sounded like there was huge fighting in Kharkiv last night. So just because we can't see it or hear it doesn't mean that it's not going on in horrific ways. Let me refresh my sources. Yeah, and there were conflicting reports about this city being overtaken by Russia, and now it's been taken back, which seems to be pretty extraordinary. But again, if Russia were expected to basically roll tanks into these cities, and be welcomed, and that hasn't happened, then you can see why there's sort of transitory back and forth and ultimate control, inverted commas. Yeah, I saw reports about Russians queuing at ATMs. Again, I think a bit early to say, but that might become clearer tomorrow. Yeah, I saw a flash here. I'm pretty confident about these cameras because Fox is showing it as well, and I just want to see if the Taiwanese news company as well. Was it CT1? I think it was CT1 or something, or CT7 maybe. Bear with me. If anyone can remember the Taiwanese feed we had yesterday, please let me know. It was in Taiwanese scripts. CT1 or something. CT1, okay. Are you from Taiwan? I can't pronounce your name, but if so, let us know what the view is in Taiwan. Yeah, I think that feed went down. Yeah, one second. But I think the Fox feed is still up. I've got that in the background, but we've got this multicam at the moment. Let us know what the view is in Taiwan, because obviously Taiwan is a very interesting. It's a very interesting situation in Taiwan. Given the relationship with China. FIFA, I was sim racing earlier. So I did about 3 hours of sim racing streaming earlier. So it's both. You can actually see that that is up on the channel. I need to kind of work out how to message that. If you do want to kind of engage in these discussions when I'm not streaming, I have put in the description of this stream, I think, a thread I posted on Twitter. I just lost my mouse. Plug that in. I did post a thread on Twitter about some stuff that I thought about having done these streams. So do go check that out. Do follow me on Twitter if you want, because that is a space that's not solely a sim racing space. That's a bit clearer. I forgot my mouse has been here so long. My mouse is out of batteries. So I need to get a long USB lead for that. How am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? Bear with me. Bear with me a second, chat. If you're wondering what's going on, I've been streaming so much the last few days that there we go. Mouse is back. All right, the mouse is back. Nice. Let me just refresh the source. Let me refresh the source as well. I think that noise you can hear, by the way, a lot of it is wind noise. We've been hearing that fairly consistently. I don't think there's a camera up on Independence Square anymore. I think it's been a long time since we've seen a camera on Independence Square. Welcome, Woody. These CCTV cameras these top two are in a cathedral that's either here or here, which is very close to Independence Square. I'm not sure we ever worked out where this roundabout is. Obviously a very distinctive roundabout. Is there a drone in the air? There's not a drone in the air that has its transponder on today. I would strongly expect that there is a drone in the air, but it's not squawking. So it's interesting that that drone was choosing to squawk. There was a lot of traffic going from Sochi, so maybe that's why. But yeah, no drone that's squawking at the moment. I think it was based out of Malta. We'll see if we see any more IL-76s going from Russia into Belarus today. I think it is important to kind of understand the context in which we see and read stuff, and maybe this is making me more like aware that I see stuff I see stuff in a Western context like NATO. I think if you're here, you see NATO as a defensive shield, but if you're here, you see NATO as you more likely see NATO as an aggressive kind of pact. Let me just refresh my sources. Yeah, there is a video of a large explosion, but it's an absolutely huge explosion, but again, that's something that you might expect from a fuel depot or something. Let me just see if it is been verified. Collins, Putin should listen to his spy chief without intimidation and better intel. Yeah, but if the whole kind of state at that level is set up to be very patriotic and very deferential, then it might inhibit kind of that questioning and honesty about capabilities. You know, we see a lot of military parades, etc., in Moscow every year, and the military being a strong source of national pride. So you can imagine it would be very difficult to question that. Welcome, Mark. Yeah, this plane here is a tanker, so the US has a 24/7 refueling present in the sky above Romania here. Whether that's been happening before the war, I don't know. There's probably another plane coming in to relieve this tanker that's here at the moment. There's some as well that hang about over Poland. It's a Polish aircraft. I didn't see the Russian defense confirm casualties. I saw that they had confirmed there were casualties, but I didn't see any numbers put down. I think I saw numbers this morning from the Ukraine MOD that the Russian casualties are over 4,000. Obviously, it's more likely that that's embellished, but if the numbers are in that region, then that is unlike anything we've seen from kind of Western nations in Gulf War, Afghanistan, etc. 4,000 is a huge number, and like we've always been saying, you don't need to, wars previously have been about inflicting losses that lead to surrenders and lead to routes kind of spreading through the army, and those are big numbers. I don't think they've been swapped, even though it's from RAF Mildenhall, which is a US airbase just outside of Cambridge. I think the RAF tankers have been operating somewhere else, but we saw RAF tankers actually come in from Cyprus, where the UK has military bases. Jumanji, I don't understand Russia sending in 3 or 4 armoured trucks to different places. Makes no sense. Yeah, I still don't. Has anyone seen anything about a rationale for the Russian advance into Kyiv 2 nights ago? I haven't seen anything. It could have been a misunderstanding. It could have been that was the plan, and then the plan was changed because perhaps Russia hadn't been able to reinforce from the air bases, but that message didn't get through to one particular group. Thanks, Sarah, for $5. Can we please discuss the cathedral bells haven't tolled the hour since 12 midnight? The bells were silent at 1 a.m. Is that normal? I think during the night last night we didn't hear church bells until the morning. I don't think we heard church bells till 6 a.m. and that might be because I saw reports that the church bells are also being used as air raid sirens, so they will be silent during the night. But again, I can't confirm it. I don't think we heard them on the hour last night, and last night we were streaming from a long time through the night. Exploratory Russian special forces, but what would the objective be? And what was the plan for extraction? Must have been Russian very fast, jeeps and vehicles coming in, but what were they trying to achieve? Unless it was a low percentage chance of capturing the Ukrainian president and Ukrainian command, and therefore it was worth it. It was worth a low percentage charge at that stage of the war, because if you could get it, you would significantly turn the tide of the war. That's the only thing I can imagine. Lipano, what are the tankers refueling? They're refueling American fighter jets. So we've seen F-16s come in to get refueled when they turn the transponders on. Yeah, so the RAF is using Voyagers coming in from Cyprus, and we saw some Eurofighters escorting them. But yeah, first day that we haven't seen, first night we haven't seen the US drone transponding over the Black Sea, but I imagine it's still there. Thanks for the Dizzling. Yep, so the convoy, I feel like from what I've seen in other maps, it's like the convoy on the west side of the river has progressed a lot more than on the east side. And it seems like they're bypassing Chernihiv now and just going straight down into Kyiv. And again, that is being completely facilitated by the ability to use Belarus territory as a launching pad and build those supply lines. You can see this, and again, these maps aren't 100% accurate, but they're indicators. But because of the strategy, it seems to not try and stop and really take over these cities with full force, but instead bypass them and encircle them. It cuts both ways, because if Russia can extend these armoured column lines and join them up, then you cut off any Ukrainian forces in this area. But on the other hand, if you extend too far with your armoured columns and you can't supply them and you get cut off, then Ukraine can cut off the the head of the armor column as well. So it kind of cuts both ways. Unknown, they're splitting Ukrainian forces trying to, yeah. And whether that was the original objective, I don't know. Whether that was a expected deviation that, you know, was likely to happen if Russia wasn't able to easily capture these cities, I don't know. But you would imagine all these things would have been explored and on the table. Let me check that one out. Want that one out, Andy? Can't see this one unless I put in the wrong registration. Richie, did Putin have a plan, or is he winging it as it goes? It seems very likely that someone would be winging it, but we were unable to really get a, for us on the stream to have a plurality like likelihood of what the true rationale was. But one that was interesting. In fact, tell me, there's 1,700 people watching, so let me know what do you think is the ultimate reason why Putin decided to invade Ukraine? Lots of reasons were given, purported reasons like eastward expansion of NATO, failure of the rules-based order to prevent Kosovo, Iraq, Iran, Syria, recognition of these regions of Donbass, Luhansk in the east of Ukraine, lack of recognition perhaps of the government Ukraine after Maidan. But so lots of reasons were given. But what do you think is the main reason? Legacy, terminal illness, trying to keep his power in the region. Ukrainian food, yeah, possible, another logical one. He doesn't really have a choice after Libya. I'm wondering, Sherry, I'm wondering if Putin's generals misled him on their confidence in military readiness. I think that's another interesting one. That may be something that the more totalitarian and authoritarian a state becomes, maybe that is an inherent weakness of that state. It becomes less, there's less discussion and less challenge and less honesty about capabilities, etc. I don't know. Black Diamond to prevent Ukraine joining NATO. NATO, AMG, he was bored. That's a bit disrespectful. TB Land, he wants more power, wants to bring back the USSR. Nicholas, I think Russia invaded because if Ukraine joined NATO, they could take back Crimea. I think what has become apparent is that after the 2014 revolutions and the response with Russia annexing Crimea, there hasn't been peace. It hasn't been sorted. It was always an issue that I think the West probably forgot about. But it was never in an acceptable position. I mean, that happens in a lot of places in the world. You can say in the Middle East as well. This is not sorted. there's disputes, and you know, Korea as well, and lots of other places. But this involving Russia really, you know, it never really was resolved. Maybe it was inevitable that it was going to continue like this. Maxi, he's not wrong when saying Ukraine has a historical link to Russia, but that's not rectified to engage in war. Eunice, what probably is clear, Putin wanted to do ASAP for the West NATO. I think Ukraine was much more likely to join the EU than NATO. You can see why. I mean, that there is a lot of logic in there. If Ukraine was close to joining NATO, then if you can invade Ukraine before it joins NATO, then NATO won't be able to support it militarily because of Article 5 collective defence. You know, if Ukraine was a part of NATO now, basically the only way Russia could invade Ukraine would be to call NATO's bluff on collective defence. Because that collective defence and the invocation of Article 5 means that Russia would be at war with the United States. And I don't know how you reconcile mutually assured destruction being a preventative force on World War III and NATO Article 5 being a kind of, if it's invoked, a surefire way to have the United States and other nuclear armed countries allied with you. Sorry, Sean, I missed that. Thanks to the Canadian 609. You're doing better than our local news here in Montreal, Canada. Thanks so much for your coverage, even though it's outside normal scope. The reason why things move slow on kind of regular news outlets is because they really have to verify things and check things, and they have different regulations in terms of what they can show on TV stations, etc. So I think it's just different strokes, right? But this definitely is I'm very lucky that we have this space. And yeah, if you don't know this, there's 1,600 people watching. I normally do sim racing. I was doing sim racing earlier, so I drive my car and I normally stream to hundreds of people racing my car. But I felt like it was really important to cover this on the first day of the war, and we've done it ever since. If you do want to talk more about it when the stream's off, I did link a Twitter thread that I posted on Twitter with some of the takeaways that I'd had from these streams. And that is a profile I have that is not just about sim racing. MBR EU chair was grandstanding today and said Ukraine is one of us, we're part of NATO. I saw the EU Commission did some fairly unprecedented things today. One of them, I think, was about organising military equipment. It's been a long dispute in the EU about that move towards having an EU army from various treaties like the Paris Treaty, Rome Treaty. And it's always been contentious, I've seen, from mainly budgetary reasons. Like, do countries want to pay towards having an EU army? I feel like it's never been in the conscious of how that would be perceived by Russia, for example. Refresh the map will do. If you want to alert me to anything, then please do at me. Yeah, so it looks like I saw reports earlier that this city had been, or town really, been taken over by Russia. It looks like it's disputed. Again, if this was a war that Russia expected to roll in because they would win hearts and minds of the civilian population in the east, then they wouldn't need to encounter too much fighting, and they could also more likely roll through towns and roll out of them. But if actually the civilian population is very hostile, then that may be why they may be having to change their plans and instead roll past these cities. I'm pretty sure these feeds are live because the Fox News one as well is from the same balcony, which I've got in the background. Beavers 87, don't think Putin would ever back down from his decision to invade. However, could his own government overthrow him? Okay, it's something we talked a lot about yesterday in terms of how this war can be resolved, and I had a lot of optimism a few days ago. Sorry for that ad, by the way, it's been inappropriate. Had a lot of optimism a few days ago when dawn rose that there would be much more focus on a diplomatic negotiated way out, but it'd be interesting to know, what do you think is the way that this war is resolved diplomatically? And the only thing I could think of, and I put that in that Twitter thread, was that Ukraine agrees to not join NATO in some kind of declaration, which can always be reneged upon, and there's some formal recognition of independence of Donbass, Luhansk, eastern regions of Ukraine. That gives Putin something to go back to in message in terms of, yeah, they've supported these purported independent regions, and they've got that assurance about NATO, and Ukraine would avoid all the bloodshed. But I don't know if in any way that's plausible. If you want this YouTube link, it is live stream events, and if you want a full screen of it, it's here as well from Fox, and the same vantage point was used yesterday by Taiwanese news and Japanese news that we were following. Thanks, David. Yeah, we thought on the first day, actually, that the AN-225 may have been destroyed. Only one of its kind. They were rebuilding another, but I think it had taken ages, maybe even decades. One of its kind plane run by Antonov, and it's to be confirmed that it has been destroyed from satellite imagery. Bill Byers, it doesn't seem that Putin can be trusted with any type of agreement at this point. That's another thing about rationality and irrationality, is how do you negotiate with someone who is in some way threatening nuclear weapons? Zentilio, this kind of behaviour dates back to 2000 BC. Can't believe that humankind is yet so primitive. The history of this continent is one that is almost entirely one of war, and it's been a very unusual time, you could say, post 1945 and the United Nations and the Charter and NATO, that yes, there were proxy wars around the world, and yes, there were wars, you know, in Yugoslavia, but there weren't wars of the same scale that we're seeing previously. And you know, the European Union, originally European Economic Community, literally designed to make sure that France and Germany couldn't go to war together again. It was pretty much unprecedented times. But it feels like that really is changing, or already has changed. George Queer, why isn't nobody sending troops? It's something we've covered a lot on the stream, but because of NATO Article 5 collective defence, if any NATO member sends troops into Ukraine and Russia engages with those troops and has casualties, some dispute about whether it needs to be on NATO territory or not, but then that nation could invoke Article 5, and then every other NATO nation would join them in war against Russia, and that would mean that you'd have nuclear armed states. I think what this shows practically is that, and we saw an incredible statement from Japan last night about wanting to be part of a collective alliance that has nuclear weapons, but it shows that really, in terms of this deterrent against Russia, nuclear weapons really are king. So in a way, it's like a vindication of mutually assured destruction. TB Land, NATO nations cannot step in with physical action unless Putin gets stupid and crosses into NATO territory. Yeah. One way that we were talking about yesterday is basically NATO have in some way said that to some degree it is acceptable for Russia to invade Ukraine. And, you know, the border is here. And obviously if Russia was to invade, for example, Poland, then there'll be a question of whether NATO would stand behind that Article 5 invocation. But assuming that it would, then Russia has to assume that it would and therefore not invade Poland. But it's getting very complicated on like a geopolitical level, because we've always taken these things for granted in terms of mutually assured destruction, NATO Article 5, and now it's really been stress tested. Here's some small arms fire at the moment. Yeah, you'll see. I haven't seen a lot over Bulgaria, to be fair, but I know over Romania. I'm sure there's another tanker coming in to relieve this one eventually, or this one doesn't look like it's been out for too long already. Do people think what's happening here makes NATO look stronger or weaker? Because it definitely feels that if you're in NATO, you're very glad you're in NATO. And if you're not in NATO but you share NATO values, then it's this uncomfortable reality that although you share the same values as NATO, NATO is not going to defend you militarily. So I don't know if that makes NATO stronger or weaker. I think the fact that Japan said, hey, you know, we need to evaluate whether we need to be in a alliance pact with members that have nuclear weapons, which is pretty extraordinary when you think about the recent history of Japan, shows that collective defense alliances that have members with nuclear weapons is a very powerful thing. Merche, of course it shows NATO is stronger, Eunice weaker and stronger, Jack flawed but stronger, Dean it appears more relevant. I think they're definitely more relevant in the consciousness of the West. Maybe they've always been relevant in the consciousness of the East, and for people that live in the West like myself, it's been difficult to see that. TB-Land, I feel like NATO is showing amazingly huge amounts of control. Super White Tour, strength on paper doesn't equal strength in reality. Merchant, Finland is continuing to join NATO now. Yeah, I think Finland can only join if Sweden joins. I'm not sure Sweden's that keen. Look, see, as of right now, it makes NATO look kind of not willing to escalate it. I don't think we've seen NATO's true strength yet. If you see NATO's true strength against Russia, the bigger question is that if the biggest threat to NATO really is the current government in Russia, and therefore to what extent NATO would want to support some sort of regime change in Russia. Because for the last 22 years, you know, Putin became president in 2000, followed Yeltsin, you know, under Yeltsin, been a very chaotic time. You know, breakdown of the Soviet Union, Yeltsin becomes president of Russia, disagreements with the Duma, the legislature, and, you know, Yeltsin on tanks outside the Duma, shelling the Duma, retakes control, new constitution, more powers to the president. Putin comes into power in 2000, tag teams with Medvedev, again pushes through amendments to the constitution, which means that he's effectively been in power for 22 years. And during all that time, Russia has been integrated and integrating with the West. So, you know, hosting the Football World Cup a few years ago, was going to be hosting the Champions League final this year, other events, Olympics, etc., Winter Olympics. But that's all changed now. It kind of feels like for a long time, Russia kind of ostensibly played ball with the West, and the West ostensibly played ball with Russia, and that's now just completely terminated. Russia is much more closer to having a North Korea type relationship with the West. Dean, I don't think Putin expected that he was going to get this kind of international response, like Germany doubling its military budget. I do think in some ways it is, in some ways look at it, is sad that the response has to be doubling military budgets, etc., because that is going to militarize the continent of Europe, rather than kind of demilitarize. But yeah, pretty extraordinary. James, yeah, that has been confirmed by the Chancellor of Germany. I think there's a one-off investment of $100 billion, and then there's a further continuous investment of increase in arms. And obviously there's been, I think, both restrictions and just like unwritten understanding that Germany wouldn't do that previously. Patrick, isn't it kind of too late to send weapons to Ukraine? Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it's like Western countries need to show that they're doing something to, you know, show their citizens, yeah, hey, you know, we hear you and we're doing something, and the being seen to do something and what effect it actually has are two separate things. So I don't know, but I know the UK said they were going to assist with the supply of weapons. But if Kyiv is going to be cut off, then I agree there's an element of it's too late, and it would have been helpful to have. Germany said it's going to provide Stinger missiles to Ukraine. Previously it said it was going to provide helmets. If it had said it was going to provide Stinger missiles when it said it was going to provide helmets, that could have been used as a provocation by Russia to invade. So you can see why there's a contradiction there. Unknown, if we send in jets, Ukraine owns the air. Yeah, but again, if a NATO jets get shot down, the only way I could see something like that happening, and it would be so critical for Ukraine if Russia does not achieve air superiority, if there is some kind of derogation from NATO or some agreement that NATO is going to support Ukraine with you know, enforcing a no-fly zone, and if any NATO planes are shot down over Ukraine, then that wouldn't be a ground to invoke Article 5. But it's very blurry anyway, because if NATO were to do that, there would be aircraft carriers and you know, planes taking off from airstrip components, etc., that would then become targets. And it's blurry anyway because the supply of weapons is basically all NATO members are trying to tread around this line where they want to provide as much support as possible without being actually involved in the war, like even like from a legal perspective. And as there's more like these are drones that Ukraine have been using, it seems, to some effect, I think, are Turkish drones. And you know, if Turkey is able to supply Ukraine with more drones, Turkey is a NATO member, and these drones are shot down, to what extent is Turkey involved in the war, etc.? So it's not as simple as it used to be in the previous days. With more autonomous weapons and weapons able to be controlled remotely, I feel like Article 5 is getting really blurred, and it's the same with cyber warfare. You know, if there's cyber warfare from the West that is trying to disrupt the Russian organisation, and Russia is, you know, throwing cyber warfare the other way, then to what extent could that be a reason to invoke Article 5? Article 5 is having to deal with these situations that probably weren't really contemplated. Liam, yeah, at what point does supplying weapons actually involve NATO? Time doesn't stand still, so when, you know, the NATO treaty was established, a lot of these things weren't really contemplated. You could even say that when the only time Article 5 has ever been invoked was after September 11th by the United States. That wasn't really that's probably quite you know, NATO was really there to be a counterpart to the Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union. So maybe that wasn't really contemplated. I didn't see what happened in the Security Council vote today. I know that it wouldn't have been binding, so it doesn't really make any difference, but it may be symbolic in terms of how people voted. TB Land, I'm beginning to believe China won't help Putin. We spoke about it last night, but the statement that China made in the UN Security Council was very interesting, saying that they believe Ukraine has to be a bridge between the East and the West, i.e. Ukraine should be prohibited from joining NATO. To what extent, and this is another uncomfortable thing, you know, it is quite, I don't know if the word is convenient, but it is quite convenient for NATO members to have Ukraine as a buffer zone. And, you know, yeah, you can send aid and support economically, but ultimately this war is not being fought over your territory. So, and it's the same for Russia with Belarus as well. You know, ultimately Belarus is a kind of buffer state for Russia. Ty says Japan is helping Ukraine. Yes, I've seen that. Jedi Master, no one is going to war over a hacking attack, even if Article 5 technically has to. I think Jens Stoltenberg, the General Secretary of NATO, he did mention that in a press conference, which I thought was pretty striking. He said it could potentially be used, but again, it's one of these statements that you say is a deterrent. I think a report just came in. What is the time now? UK. Yeah, a tweet has just come in from the Ukrainian president saying he spoke with the UK Prime Minister about an anti-war coalition. Those are obviously very strong words, having an anti-war coalition. And Boris Johnson did say in the UK Parliament that eventually the help would be militarily, but he didn't expand what that would be. Sorry, Myers, if I missed something, if that was directed at me. Yeah, there has been a huge blast. I think it's still being verified. Let me go back down to that. It looked like a fuel depot or something like that. So let me get that up. So this is a very big blast, and I think it is in the process of people trying to verify where it is, but it's a huge blast, as you'll see now. and it looks similar to what you see when there's explosions at fuel depots, etc. That shockwave. But I'm still waiting on more confirmations on that. Oh, it has been verified as an ammunition depot. I don't think that would be. I don't. That's much bigger than a kind of tactical thermobaric weapon would. An explosion of that sort would produce. There's fuel depots, fertilizer plants, grain storage is a big one. These sort of things combust fairly regularly in complete peacetime, and they have similar explosions, but I'm not an expert. Let me just refresh everything. The only news I've seen recently is I saw earlier that Russia had, or there were, I saw statements from the Ukrainians that Russia had taken over this town here. There's reports now that it has is now back under Russian control. And again, my speculation is that if Russia expected to roll through and kind of be waved through the streets of these cities because they had an inherently kind of favourable civilian population, if that's not the case, then that might change the whole way they need to approach it. Also a big question mark that if the Russian troops expected to kind of roll through these towns and cities and be welcomed and be seen as liberators and then kind of roll on through to Kyiv having gone through this territory and be seen as liberators, if that hasn't happened, then that is, you know, to put it very simply, obviously massively demoralizing. And if there have been lots of reports about Russian troops running out of fuel and supplies, I don't know to what extent that's actually the case generally, or if there's isolated cases, or you know, if it's been embellished. But if they are being delayed and they're having to adjust their plans, and they were planning to kind of overtake these cities and then overtake the barracks and supply lines, etc., and that hasn't happened, then you can imagine why there might be some supply lines. Thanks, Sarah. As a chemical engineer, thermobaric weapons like the TOS-1 are my greatest immediate concern for Ukraine, short of low tactical nukes. Yeah, it's interesting that like the TOS-1, there's been images of it kind of in Ukraine as it's been rolling down the streets from CCTV cameras and camera phones, etc. It reminds me of the Buck missile that was involved in the shooting down of MH17. That was eventually kind of traced by the Dutch investigators using camera footage, etc. And if it is such an important piece of military hardware, you'd think that it would be of high importance for Ukraine to really target that and follow that that intelligence. But it may be that they're getting absolutely incredible intelligence from the West anyway, from satellite or AWACS planes or etc., or intercepting. AWACS planes wouldn't see anything on the ground, but intercepting Russian radio messages, etc. Reeby, do you think that if Russia takes Ukraine, this will allow Putin to make greater pushes to other countries? I think any country that is now not part of NATO is probably now weaker in terms of what realistic happens than it was before, perhaps. But if you're in NATO, you've seen to the defence to which NATO members have kind of been there, and you would assume that they would stand by you militarily if you were a NATO member. So it kind of cuts both ways. I don't know which other countries you're thinking about. And I have seen a lot of satellite imagery. Last night we was looking at satellite imagery that was indicating things on fire at airports, etc., like sort of thermal imaging. Zach Brown worried for Finland. I think there's there's a history of Russia trying to invade Finland, and that's a different ball game. That territory and that theatre. Let me refresh my sources. Looks like more protests as well being reported in Russia, in Moscow. I did see protests in Moscow being reported on Russian state TV, which is interesting. I imagine if the information on that is just generally available, then it needs to be acknowledged by state TV and then sort of can be, you know, messaged. Yeah, Melitopol in the south. There were conflicting reports yesterday that had been taken over. I've read lots of reports today about amphibious assaults. Didn't seem like Ukraine had much of a navy at all after Crimea, so Russia will be able to do what it wants really from a kind of naval amphibious assault perspective. This map, I suspect, is quite significantly out of date in terms of the territory. You'd expect the Russian armour columns to be progressing and then troops behind them fanning out to secure that territory and cut off any Ukrainian troops behind them. I don't know if there have been any confirmed reports of armour columns meeting and therefore patches of Ukraine being cut off apart from the cities. Well, I just got a really big announcement here. EU countries will provide fighter jets to Ukraine under Brussels funding. This is coming from AFP. This is a pretty astonishing announcement. I don't know how practically that would work, because, and this is a thing that I think I miscalculated. I had thought that at the beginning of the war, Russia threw cruise missiles and shock insertion of troops, paratroopers, flying in low in helicopters, would be able to secure airfields in Ukraine and establish complete air superiority. And it seems like that hasn't happened. All this stuff about the ghost of Kyiv, which is almost certainly some kind of urban legend, but the bigger fact is that Ukraine still seems to be able to get planes up in the sky, engage, and then get those planes down, resupply them, refuel them, repair them, and get them back up again, which is extraordinary. Because Russia, you know, has, you know, cruise missiles it can deploy from the Black Sea, from aircraft that are over Russian territory. So how do people think how do people think that this is going to happen? But I need to really verify that, because that is quite extraordinary. I'd seen it earlier, but it seems to be more widely reported now. But I don't. Extraordinary if that is the case. Stanley Plank, very dangerous move. It only serves to up the ante. Find out resident US has been air refueling. I've heard that a few times. I suspect that's speculation. I don't think these tankers are here to refuel Ukrainian aircraft, because it's not really about refueling. It's about rearming and resupplying and repairing, and you know, swapping pilots, etc. You need infrastructure for that at airfields. You need aviation fuel for that to be supplied. Unless I don't know. That would be a very big surprise to me if that was happening, but you never know. I know there was a Ukrainian fighter jet that did, I think, get escorted into Romania on the first day of the war because it had some sort of malfunction, so it was escorted in by F-16 fighter jets. There's been lots of disputed reports about how close the Russian army is from Kyiv. I think ultimately we could definitely hear fighting on the second night, getting closer to these cameras here, which are in this district. There's different levels of the Russian army being there. On the first day, Russia inserted through low-flying helicopters paratroopers at this airport in an attempt to secure it, presumably so they could secure it, take over the anti-air defense, and then fly in cargo planes with armor, with troops, with supplies, and secure that, and then wait for the armor column that was going through Chernobyl to meet them. That seemed to be all disrupted. Been multiple reports of cargo planes being shot down, Russian cargo planes being shot down, coming into this airbase. And when I say cargo planes, you can put anything in that cargo plane. You put troops, tanks, supplies. So I don't know. The maps I've seen indicate that there's been more progress down the west side of the river than the east side. Whether that's due to this battle at Kyiv, I don't know. That looks to be holding out. Yeah, we've been following these tankers for a few days now. No doubt there'll be one coming in to relieve this Russian tanker when it needs to RTB eventually. But we have seen F-16 refueling. I don't know if the US has always had a presence there in the skies above Romania, just as kind of is strategically important in the state of readiness, or when, depending on what state of readiness the US Army is in, they have this presence. But it would be pretty extraordinary if Ukrainian fighter jets are being refueled here. I'm going to just say I think it's probably not the case, because Ukrainian fighter jets are actually, I think all of them are Russian made, so very different hardware. Yeah, I'm sure someone in chat can explain the thermobaric ordnance better than me, but I understand that it's a different way of fueling the explosion, so it essentially sucks in oxygen to fuel that explosion, and there's a large pressure difference created as well. Let me pop that in. I think that will be another tanker, although there have been different tankers flying over Poland as well. US has bases in Poland, in Germany, in the UK. Can't find that one actually. Vioma, how will they supply supplies to Ukraine? You'd imagine that there's going to be... It's very important for Ukraine to maintain a supply corridor from Poland. And also you're going to have a constant flow of refugees. I saw figures say of up to 300,000 refugees going into Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, which is a huge amount of people that we haven't seen that level in Europe for obviously a very long time. So there's humanitarian reasons why that corridor needs to be maintained. There was that report on the second day that the US had offered to extract the Ukrainian president, which would have involved, you would think, some US troops being there on the ground or airlifting him out. There were a lot of nations beforehand saying that they were assisting Ukraine on the ground to kind of prepare for any invasion, but I think the wording was very careful to not say troops, as we've seen in a lot of other theatres. But do you think Australia will come on in? Don't understand the context of that. It seems to me at the moment that there was a kind of shock offensive into Kyiv very early in the war, perhaps designed to put Kyiv in this state of readiness, perhaps designed to distract the Ukrainian forces from defending in the east, perhaps to see how the Ukrainian president and the top of the state would react. And now we're in a state where Russia is trying to build these supply lines. So push forward with armoured columns, have a supply line where fuel supplies, repairs, personnel can be brought up to the front line, and then besiege these cities. We're probably already seeing it in the east. I suspect this map with Kharkiv might be a bit outdated, and Russia is in the process of encircling it. We've seen it with Chernihiv here. You know, there will be a supply line established, ironically, going from Belarus. Really, I've been trying to track down any types of Air Force planes. I don't know what you mean. Do you mean what types of planes the military have? Because you can do that on Wikipedia. I think there is actually a Wikipedia map as well. Wait a minute. So this is a map from Wikipedia. And it's another way that you can see. Again, I don't know how accurate it is, but you can see how the armor columns are progressing. And for example, as the armor columns progress, you'd imagine that the Russian troops behind are fanning out to secure territory. And for example, if these columns are linked, then this part of Ukraine is cut off, and any Ukrainian troops here are cut off. Same here. You cut off these pockets. Same here. Same here. You encircle Kharkiv. So you can see that this armor column is push, and I don't know how accurate it is, but pushing to Kyiv, and puts the Ukrainian troops in a difficult perspective about on what front they fight. I think this is pretty much exactly what the Blitzkrieg doctrine was in World War II. That was so effective, kind of pushing forward, and then putting the defending troops in this position about on what front they fight. Yeah, we saw that Naxi. There were reports that as a condition, well, there was no preconditions to what needed to be agreed in the meetings with Russia, I think around this area here, hosted by Belarus. But as part of that agreeing to enter in some sort of negotiations, allegedly Belarus had agreed to not permit any further Russian troops to enter from Belarus territories, aircraft to take off. However, in the chronology that I was following it, after that, there were multiple reports of 2 missiles being sent in from Belarus. Shoot West cut off. They live in that country. Good luck stopping supplies. Yeah, it's a very good point. It's a very good point. Maybe I was too simplistic in my term. I was trying to explain what we might see happen with these armor columns. I think the bigger this is, and again we're talking about miscalculations, but the slightly bigger point is that if Russia expected to just roll through these cities and be welcomed in, because the perception was that the civilian population in these cities would be sympathetic to the Russian forces or wouldn't put up as much of a resistance, then they could roll in. That would be an important psychological coup for them in terms of how it would affect the Ukrainians in the west of the country. But it seems pretty much like that hasn't happened. Severe fighting, no doubt, in the south here, because there have been lots of reports about these cities changing hands. And I think a lot of people have seen video footage today, yesterday, day before, about kind of relatively unarmoured Russian troops and vehicles in the middle of these cities being repelled. It just seems like it would be a shock if Russia had severely miscalculated this, but stranger things have happened. And if they have miscalculated it, then it's a huge miscalculation, because not only is it miscalculating how this war is panning out, but also, you know, they've shown their hand in terms of the regard for the international community. The mask has slipped in a way, and there's been sanctions like we've never seen before on Russia. Modern day Russia. And I don't see how those are going to be rowed back. It's also pretty incredible to see Belarus down here, to see Belarus playing such an active role. I think in Western conscious, you know, I've been to all of these countries. I've never been to Belarus. I've never really thought why. So I've been to all of these countries, but I've never been to Belarus. And I'd never really thought about it as, you know, in Russia's sphere of influence, but now it's becoming more and more apparent. There's 1,070 people watching. People ask me why I'm interested in this, etc. So I'm naturally curious. When I was younger, I cycled from London to Istanbul, to Turkey, and I cycled through a lot of these countries. I spent time in Lithuania, Latvia, a lot of time in Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, Turkey. And when I was at university, I also studied the Russian Constitution, constitutional affairs, Soviet and post-Soviet. Did a lot of model United Nations and that kind of, like, I don't know what the word is, fake diplomacy or whatever. So it's always been interested. And I think for a lot of people watching, it's, you know, you might have friends or partners that just might not be interested in this, because if you're, you know, in the United States, or if you're in, you know, the west of Europe, or if you're in South America. But I think for a lot of people around the world, it's very gripping, and we want to know and think about what this means for the world. Some of us have a bit of a different connection with the relationship between states on the world stage. Yeah, I did it on my bicycle. It took 2 months actually, and I set off in September, and I flew back in December. But let's do like a bit of a roll call. Where are people watching this evening around the world? Because we've had a lot of people watching previously from the United States. I'm not in the United States. I'm in London. It's like a bag of money over London. Albanian Shill is unsurprisingly from Albania. CMLT, Josh. Oh, it all goes really quick. Josh from UK, Darren UK, Jedi Texas, Bandit Montana, Thorsten from Germany. Hang on, I want to keep track. Blythe, Routine Trees from USA, Helsies from UK, Arcades from France, Schumacher from Poland, Lelivia from Belgium, Andrews from Idaho, I remember, Zach Brown's from Florida. Good to see a lot of names that are familiar as well, which is pretty cool. Fanners from Netherlands, Gary Scotland, Reebies from Australia, Mark England, Acronis Western Canada, That IT Guys from Indiana, Jonathan USA, Gabriel Mexico, Kegel Massachusetts, Apathy New Zealand. Apathy, how do you feel about it? Were you the same person that was mowing your lawn on the first day? Southgate Outs from England, Nicholas from Florida, Designated Sweden, Brent Australia, Backlog California, Spencer Dalton's from the USA. Whoa, that was a much bigger explosion we could hear. All people from New Zealand, Fox in Hungary. What's the feeling in Hungary? Equinox, Ireland, Exeter, Poland, Kosovo, not sure about North Korea, Croatia, Cardiff, Switzerland. What's the view in Switzerland, Foxclane? As a historically very neutral country, is this showing the strength of being part of an alliance? So Switzerland, for example, not in the European Union. More people from New Zealand, Island Crew in the house, Seattle, Istanbul. One of the most notable things when I arrived in Istanbul, it was very interesting seeing the culture and the architecture and the people change. Although I have to tell, everywhere I went, I just was meeting very, very kind and nice, supportive people. But coming to Istanbul, it's like Europe, because Europe changes. The further east you go, Europe really changes, and it does feel more. It's obviously more Slavic, but it feels more Soviet influence as well. But then in Turkey, it just really just crashes into Asia. It's almost like the tectonic plates crashing into each other. There's another big flash there. And the Bosphorus is, really recommend going and seeing the Bosphorus. It's an incredible sight. Warships, little ships, little boats, you know, huge commercial ships, and these big bridges that go across it, and obviously very, very old treaties determining what Turkey can and cannot do with the Bosphorus. Like, it was a Suez Canal before the Suez Canal, really. Panama, whichever is your favourite canal. Cherry, Europe looks so squished on the map. Europe is a very, very small place. It's been interesting doing these streams, and I'm not going to stay up super late tonight. So it's midnight. I'm probably going to end this stream about 1 AM UK time. But the last couple of nights, I've been streaming from about midnight to about 8 AM or something. I can't remember. It's been interesting seeing the sun come up in Kyiv. So the sky gets lighter in Kyiv at about 6 AM. In Sumy, which is a bit further east, it gets lighter earlier, but about 6 AM Kyiv time, you'll see the sky get lighter, and I think official sunrise time is about 6:40 AM. But it's been interesting to see the sun come up, and then like very quickly after, the sun comes up in London, which brings it home. Nicholas wants to visit Europe. Do more people watching think if this invasion is repelled and Ukraine, you know, it remains intact, do people feel like they would want to visit Ukraine? Do people feel like they would want to visit Russia? Has this made anyone feel like they more inquisitive about Russia? Obviously, it's very difficult to do so now, but up until a few days ago, it was very easy to visit Russia. Okay, Danny? Albina says none. Yochi says not Russia. Brent says no. Igla says not Russia. Yes, Ukraine, not to Russia. Gary says love to go to both. So a lot of people saying yes to Ukraine, no to Russia. If I'm a Ukraine overlord in the West. Interesting. So a lot of people are saying yes to Ukraine, but absolutely no to Russia. I think that probably reflects just how cut off Russia is going to be now from the rest of the international community. And maybe they underestimated how strongly people would feel in the West about supporting Ukraine. I don't know. Slow says I'd visit Russia as part of an invasion force. It's a very loaded comment. I mean, it is interesting. If, to be very, very cynical about it, you know, this is great intelligence for NATO on how effective Russia's military is. Russia will have watched what the Western coalition would have done in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and to a lesser extent Libya. You know, Russian troops are on the ground in Syria, so you know, it's interesting that Syria was a huge topic a few years ago, and having seen Saddam Hussein, you know, toppled, having seen Gaddafi toppled, it's interesting to think that Assad is still president in Syria. So you can say that really wasn't a successful intervention from the West in terms of what they wanted to achieve there, in terms of toppling the Assad regime, but Assad is still president in Syria. So maybe that was a inverted commas win for Russian military effectiveness. But it seems here that Russia's military is really being exposed in terms of not being as effective as maybe it was perceived. And the more Russia commits into this, the weaker Russia's military becomes. And I don't know to what... surely there is a increased appetite for the West to, in various ways, support and enact some sort of regime change in Russia. And obviously the big question is to what extent the Russian population, which is a vastly diverse population in terms of when you think about cultural differences. I mean, Russia also borders Japan. So Russia borders Japan and Ukraine. Although I understand a lot of the architecture in this part is still inverted commas European. Escape cows, I won't go back to Russia as long as Putin's in power. John, if the Russian military is forced to retreat, I'm worried about how Putin will react to that. It's interesting because I've really struggled, and I think I've failed. One of my failings amongst many failings is that I've maybe applied too much of a logical, rational framework to things and just expect things to be dictated by what I perceive as logical and rational reasoning. Maybe that's just how I view everything I do in my daily life as well, which I need to think about. But it seems to be that there's some, inverted commas, irrational drivers here, like legacy, like destiny to land, or destiny to restore not just the Soviet Union but kind of pre-Soviet glories of Russia, how Putin will be remembered alongside Brezhnev, Khrushchev, Lenin, Stalin, previous Russian and Soviet leaders. And how do you negotiate that? Apathy. Does Russia not have the capability to level Kyiv with conventional weapons? This intrinsically is not. I think there is a little bit of clarity that I'm starting to get here in my mind, that it feels like Russia really did believe that the people of Ukraine, and you have to remember that Ukrainian governments have sometimes been Russian leaning, sometimes been Western leaning. And there's been the Orange Revolution in 2004. There was the Maidan Revolution in 2014. And there's been different presidents and prime ministers that have been Russian leaning, European leading. And because of that, Russia may have thought, Russia may, or the Russian state may really think that, hey, the only reason why the current government is power is because of propaganda from the West, and that's not really what the Ukrainian people want. The Ukrainian people really want to be, part of a sphere of influence under Russia. And if they really believe that, and that is really not the case, including in the East, where Russia has been supporting these independence movements, then it's a big miscalculation. And it also means that if they'd really thought that, and on that basis they had decided to invade, they would not have expected to be required to inflict significant damage and casualties, because they would have expected to be more welcome. I don't know what people think about that. What do people think about that? I might be in danger of just applying kind of the things that, the frameworks that I've always understood that might not be appropriate. But Jim, Russia thought it had another Crimea cakewalk. Stanley, east of the river has always been pro-Russia, still is. If it has been pro-Russia, then why have these cities not fallen? I think a really interesting map would be to kind of geolocate the examples of where civilians have really pushed back against Russian troops. So, for example, standing in the way of the tanks and, throwing rocks at the tanks, etc. Obviously, that doesn't represent a majority, but where there are examples, it will be interesting to see. And are they all in these western parts? Obviously, there's no Russian troops here, where you'd expect the population to be the most European sympathetic. Sorry, I missed that. Jay Wood, he doesn't want to level Kyiv. It's Russia according to him. Yeah, exactly. Cool, Grave. Have you watched RT? I have been watching RT from time to time. Sound like a not an explosion, that just small arms fire. I think it's been banned now in the West. I think the European Commission today have banned it. But it's a very different. So what I would say about Russia today, I only watched the English version. I've only seen the English speaking version of it, so it's deliberately aimed towards not a domestic audience, it's aimed toward the West. It's always seemed particularly unsophisticated in the way that it's presented its messaging. It's come across as very clumsy, very, dare I say, unbelievable to people who watch a lot of news. But it is culturally different. If you watch Indian news of this coverage, in fact, I can get some Indian news up just to show you just how different the coverage is of war in India Just show you how culturally different it is to, for example, you know, Euronews or France 24. So news is reported culturally in different ways, but Russia Today has always seemed not to be particularly sophisticated. It's always had to hire, you know, English-speaking anchors and reporters, and every so often they seem to resign and say they can no longer agree with it. Okay. It's dead in the night. Right, bear with me, this might play some sound.
This new device.
It's earwax again.
यूक्रेन ने लूज वो अपनी पोजीशन कंसोलिडेट कर रहा है. ध्यान से सुने एम्बियंस.
This is how the news is reported in India, and this is actually fairly restrained.
बड़ी खबर है क्योंकि अभी तक ये अटैक्स सिर्फ रशिया से सुनाई दे रहे थे, लेकिन अब यूक्रेन की तरफ से ऐसा किया जा रहा है.
Fight. Will action be taken against that tank man remains to be seen, but I...
Yeah, I'll find some examples of time. Basically, news is reported culturally in different ways. Like we saw yesterday, Taiwanese news and Japanese news kept their webcams up, but the Western news didn't. So, anyways. The interesting thing is that the reason why I've been following some Indian news is that the Indian news channels do actually have reporters down on the ground. I think there is a significant, not significant, but there is an Indian, there are Indian people on the ground in Ukraine. I don't know whether it's students or maybe like some sort of outsourcing or something. But it's of great interest to those agencies. Thanks so much for $10. Belarus allows Russia to work on Ukraine from its land. Not at war, Belarus is. I don't understand why we're not hearing more about Belarus from Western countries. And it's a question I asked right at the beginning of the stream. Has war been officially declared? Because there was a statement today I saw from Turkey saying they effectively considered that there is a war and therefore they're going to enact some provisions from that treaty. I guess what that parts of the treaty say is that if some of the countries that benefit from that treaty go to war, then they lose some of the access. That's what I presume. But this is very dangerous because this is how, for example, the Second World War started. Actually, more the First World War started. Countries starting to war with each other and ally, and before you know it, you have a world war. And if it's not a war, I don't know why it's not considered a war. I know the messaging I've seen on Russian TV is that they have not called it an invasion. I've seen English-speaking hosts say the word invasion in their reporting and then almost bite their tongue after. But they're not presenting it as an invasion. They're presenting it not as a liberation. There's some other word they use, but it's irrelevant anyway because it's an English translation. But there's some word they're using. Because if it is a war, then, you know, Belarus is part of it. I think it's fair to say. And again, I don't know how much, for people who are watching, you know, news channels, etc. I don't know how much these news channels are talking about Belarus, but it's huge. If we go back to this map here, the fact that Russian troops were able to come in from Belarus, where they were doing purported training exercises, has fundamentally changed how Ukrainians had to deal with this invasion. Because if they weren't able to, if Russia weren't able to come through here, A, Chernobyl might have been secured internationally or something, because there's international scientists there, there's US scientists there, and B, they wouldn't have had to defend so much on this western front of Kyiv. It'd be very much trying to present some sort of front eastward and southwards, I would imagine. And maybe this is the rationale for the incursion we saw on the first night or the second night. You know, a show of force by Russia that, hey, we can roll in troops down this boulevard in Kyiv, and that means that Kyiv is on a constant state of alert. A lot of resource, attention is being focused here by Ukraine, and that wouldn't necessarily have to be the case if Russia hadn't been able to progress down the west side of this river, even the east side, from Belarus. The radioactive duster, I think, is true, but it's one of these things. I think there's a lot of things in the news that get clicks, I'd imagine, and one of them is talking about Chernobyl. Another one is talking about readiness of nuclear weapons. We talked about why Chernobyl was on the way to Kyiv a lot of times before, and there was some dispute about preventing the usual kind of what's the word? I'm getting very tired. The usual handover of scientists at Chernobyl, which put the decommissioning in danger. I think the radioactive dust was possibly even like tanks moving in or some kind of shelling nearby would have kicked up dust, and that was reported on sensors, but it was still a very low level. Albania, what exactly happens when the capital falls? If the capital falls, two questions. Does the Ukrainian state or head of state fall with it? If the Ukrainian head of state isn't captured with the full Ukraine and is evacuated, which would be pretty astonishing, but then maybe there's, a formal, the Ukrainian state formally remains, but it doesn't control any eastern territory by that stage, you would presume. If Kyiv falls and the head of state is captured or eliminated, then that's a really interesting question, because presumably Russia will look to install someone and claim that they are the legitimate state, and therefore you have essentially what will be one side will consider it a forgotten what the word is, but not government in exile, but a rebellion, or not the official head of state. It's more fire here. Thanks, George, $10. It's very obvious that Russian military prowess was propaganda out of Russia. They believe their own lies based on the poor performance. The conflict army does not work. I agree with that to an extent, but I do still think it's early days, and it's just too early to tell whether Russia would have expected quite a bit more fire now. I'll shut up. Whether Russia would have expected that resistance and therefore sent in its softer troops, to be grinded, to be targets when the Ukrainians had more air force presence in the sky. And then once the Ukrainian air force has been grinded down, Russia has air superiority. It can roll in these TOS ones that we've seen, newer weaponry, the newer tanks, and they're less at risk from Ukraine. So there's 1,500 people watching. So just as another reminder, this channel, I've grown as a sim racing channel. I normally stream to hundreds of people racing virtual cars around virtual tracks, which I was doing earlier this evening. But since the start of the war, I thought it was important to stream this. So I've said that every evening UK time, I'm going to stream for a couple of hours. There'll be a place here that we can chat and catch up and think about if things that we thought would happen have happened, or if things are taking an unusual turn, track things that are maybe getting out of control, and hopefully be a space where people can ask questions and get that comfort that you can ask those questions and think about it, because I know a lot of the other streams are just absolute emoji spam. I'd imagine this one is as well. But if you do want to discuss, if you have any other streams that you really rate, put their titles in this chat so people know where to go, because I'm hopeful there are other streams out there like this. But we have a much better chat than this stream. We have a much better chat, and a lot of that is basically down to you. It's not down to me. It's down to you and the moderators. Yeah, put some other streams in here if you recommend them, because I'm only going to be streaming a couple of hours every night. I'm not going to be doing the overnight streams that I've been doing UK time during the week, because I've got to work. And if you do want to continue the chat outside of these streams, I have put a link to my Twitter thread I posted today in the description of this video. And actually, if you are interested in these things, I would really appreciate if you agree or disagree with some of the things that I put in that Twitter threads, because I basically just tried to put down my thoughts of everything I've been thinking about having done these streams. So there's like 10 kind of learnings about NATO, UNSC, mutual destruction, Putin rationale, and Yeah, it'd be interesting to get your thoughts. Martin, the Russian strategy is to use light infantry to encircle, then use a heavy power to finish them off. The thing is, though, there is a contradiction here, and I was surprised to see footage of the rocket. By the way, I expected to see more use by Ukraine of that very stark image of that residential tower block in Kyiv being struck by a rocket, and I don't think I've really seen that massively reported. I thought that would be a defining image of the early stages of the war, but it hasn't. So that's interesting. But I was surprised to see that image on Russian state TV or state news, and also some instances of firefighting in Kyiv, because that acknowledges that there is fighting in Kyiv, and the rest of the presentation was very much talking about supporting the independence movements in Donbass and Luhansk. Thanks, Fion. The only kind of qualities I'll say I've had is that I'm used to sim racing to hundreds of people and doing live streams and sitting in my chair for... I did a race a few months ago where I raced for 10 hours straight. So those are maybe there's some transferable things there. But I'm not an expert on military history. I'm not an expert on military strategy. It's just we live in this insane age where we have live feeds and we can see all the reports and we can see videos as they come in. And the difference between the kind of regular news outlets is that they have to verify all of these things, they have to check them, and there's a very slow process, and they have to cover other stories, etc. I'm actually going to be on holiday next week because there's a very big game coming out for this channel, so I'm actually going to be on holiday this Friday and then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, so potentially I might really put myself to the mill and will stream, maybe like 18 hours a day out of those days. We can do it. Yeah, the messaging is becoming a little... So the messaging I've seen out of Ukrainian figures like the foreign minister, the president, Vitaly Klitschko, previously has been very coherent. There's a very striking video we saw of the Ukrainian president a couple of nights ago where he said, I am here in Ukraine. My ministers are here. I'm here in Kyiv. My minister's here. We are here. Kyiv is safe. And then the next day he walked around Kyiv and said, they didn't manage to take Kyiv. Kyiv is here. I'm here. It's safe. That messaging is starting to fragment a little bit as we've seen conflicting reports about some of these population centres being taken over and then recaptured, the invasion of Kharkiv being repelled. And I remember being pretty astonished yesterday that Russia hadn't managed to capture any of these major population centres, Sumy, Kharkiv, Donetsk it seems, Mariupol, Kherson, Odessa, that are either very close to the Black Sea or the Russian border. And I'm beginning to think more and more that they probably did expect to roll in and occupy them in a much easier fashion, and they maybe didn't expect to be repelled, and maybe that's having an effect on morale. Maybe they're having to change things. Maybe they're deliberately trying to avoid the cities now because they would just get bogged down there, and really it's going to become a situation of applying that pressure to Kyiv, putting the best troops and best equipment there. Big question about how Ukraine really decided to defend Kyiv. Did they try and really try and support a very large perimeter? But the larger perimeter you support, the more likely that Russia can use, I've said it before, like more indiscriminate destructive weaponry. Whereas if you reduce the perimeter to the city centre, this is when it becomes very hellish for tanks to try and advance down here. Big targets for, a militia or a recently armed civilian population that seem to have a lot of Molotov cocktails, etc. And almost, you would say, impossible for Russia to really occupy Kyiv in that way without some insane levels of destruction. So, I don't know. Nicholas says smaller, bog the streets down. Welcome, Fatty. Also, the weather is going to change the longer this goes on. It is still very... I think the Iraq War, I think it was 27 days before kind of the Iraq War was considered a success. And here we're only, what, 4 days in? And it's pretty clear that, A, Russia hasn't been able to establish air superiority like the West did in the Gulf War in Afghanistan and Libya. And B, the Ukrainians are putting up much stronger resistance on the ground. There's another aspect that's different between, you know, when the Soviets went into Afghanistan, when the West went into Afghanistan, and you know, these Middle Eastern countries. That there's a bigger cultural difference here between the enemy. When you're trying to occupy Afghanistan, the enemy look different to you. They sound different to you. The villages and the towns look different to your villages and towns. They are much more easily viewable as an enemy. Whereas when you're rolling into Ukraine and people are able to speak Russian back at you, and the terrain is similar, the people look similar, the streets feel familiar, then again that has a psychological impact on the Russian forces carrying out the invasion. We're at this weird state in history, not a weird state, but we're at this state in history where, yes, weapons are very much advanced, but it's still humans who are driving these tanks. It's still humans who are holding these rifles, and humans are always vulnerable to information and morale, etc. We're still not at the stage where, you know, it's kind of a lot of autonomous weaponry being sent in. But think about this US drone that's been in the skies above the Black Sea. It's able to be there for 33 hours because that pilot doesn't need to eat or sleep. There's no pilot there. It's remotely controlled. It can be done on shifts. So perhaps it's scary to think that this is not the final frontier of warfare. In some ways it's still old-fashioned. It's actual people doing it. Benjamin, I agree. I need to be... I'm actually very fatigued because I've been streamed Thursday night, 5 hours, streamed Friday night, I think midnight to 8 AM, and streamed last night 10 till 5 AM. I've done some 3 hours of sim racing today streaming because that's what this channel is about really, and streaming here. So we're gonna go to 1 AM UK time, and then we're gonna end the stream, and then I'll do a couple of hours every night, probably about 10 PM UK time. I will refresh the map. Yeah, again, these kind of statements are both domestically focused and focused towards Ukraine, because these states want to show their population that they are doing something, but you have to question just how effective it can be. And there is always a danger that these supplies might get in and they might end up in the hands of, you know, the Russian forces, because Ukraine doesn't have the, you know, the control of the territory to get these in the right hands. Thanks, Ian, for becoming a member. So the reason why my membership tiers are called like military ranks is a very long story with we pretended we were sponsored by a tinned pie company. The name of the tin pie company is also the name of a tank in World War One. So I've never seen that, John, but good to see you. And I know you've been in a lot of these streams actually. I do always like streaming. It's and we're very lucky to always have a really good chat, and a lot of that has been down to the moderators, but also the people that somehow find your way into the stream. I don't know how that happens. Hey Fatty, good to see you. Thanks for the $10. What are the maps? This is live UA map, which has some level of verification in it. Geolocates recent events in Ukraine. This is Flight Radar 24. Looks like this tanker is RTB, but I can't see who it's been replaced by. And this is actually a Wikipedia map of the conflict. So that's what I've got up at the moment. Yeah, it is. This is, by the way, this is a community now, and I need the time to. I'm struggling with it because I also have a sim racing community. But this is your community. Like, communities are. It's not the person streaming, it's the person in the community. So I'm just happy I can kind of facilitate a place for that. But this is your community. Definitely, but I would say feels like much less activity than we saw in Ukraine 2 nights ago, where it was, I would say, scary for anyone who was on that stream. It felt scary, even though we're a long way away from it. I certainly felt scared and on edge when you could hear the fighting progress down here. We also had those markings. Do you remember the markings that were going up on the buildings? There was these reports about Russian saboteurs in the city. Watch out for Russian saboteurs. These strange illuminated lights. We saw like the strobe lighting, fluorescent lighting, and this feeling of like, what is going to happen? Definitely feel less on edge now. I don't know what the feeling is in Kyiv. I don't know if the longer you hold out, the more emboldened you become, or the longer you are under siege, the more worn down you become, the more demoralised. I imagine it's both, and it's what affects you more. Be interesting. Anyone who was on the last couple of nights and also watching now, how different do you feel? How different do you feel now? Not about what you think is going on in the situation, but how do you feel now differently? Do you feel better, or are you feeling more that kind of like sick when your stomach drops, like, this is getting worse? Do you feel it's getting worse? Do you feel better? Do you feel the same? Sorry if this noise goes up at some point and gets loud, I'll put it back down. Ian, I reckon it can become demoralising, but then again, the support of weapons and money can help with morale. Yes, you'd have to imagine that there's more banding together, and practically perhaps your neighbours that you wouldn't always speak to that much, you now really know the people in your block, you know the people across the street from you, and it really brings you together. I would imagine. I'm just pure speculation, but for someone who is in London and you take the underground every day and you don't speak with anyone in your train carriage, but you might see these people like every few days, but you never speak with them, you never look at them because that's not the done thing. You kind of go in this isolation in underground tunnels, and you go to your office and then you speak to a few people. I know it's we culturally different here, but if it's anything similar to like that, then this would completely transform social relations in that city. Let me catch up. Okay, a lot of procedural stuff has happened today. That does seem important, big picture. Dicky boy, I feel less confident in anything I know due to the information propaganda war. Aaron, I feel the balance has turned. I really thought Ukraine would not be able to withstand, and the EU would. Miss Sandwich, pretty much the same. Good to see a lot of familiar names, by the way. James, I feel discouraged realising that these old school folks are still, old school fools are still running the place. It does strike me that a lot of world leaders are very old, but obviously the older you get, the more knowledge and learnings you've acquired over that time. But as you get older, you surely become more vulnerable to just cognitively slowing down, and also your perspective is different. I don't know if when you get older, the idea of leaving a legacy becomes really important. Like, I'm going to die in the not too distant future. What's my legacy? I don't know if that becomes important. I think when you're young, for a lot of people, you just live in the present. I don't know. Probably speaking for myself though. Gary, I'm more anxious now. Putin thinks Russia and his name are interchangeable, and with the largest nuclear arsenal at his disposal, if he sees his end coming, I think he'd really good to give an order. It'd be interesting if he gave the order and that order was rejected. that would essentially be the beginnings of a coup. There was obviously the very famous incident with, I think it was Stanley Petrov, who was a Russian military commander, I think in Moscow. I think this was in the 80s. Russia had just updated their nuclear warning system, and that nuclear warning system gave an alert that there were 5 nuclear warheads being deployed from America and then making their way to Russia. And that general, I think, unilaterally decided not to act on it. Like, his instructions were, if you see that, you launch the nuclear weapons or you escalate it. I don't know how much is urban legend and how much is confirmed, but I think generally he decided not to act on it because the system was new and he didn't think that a nuclear war would start with so few warheads. But this is the really interesting thing, and I know it's getting late in the UK, but it's like about the nuclear statements today, is that it makes sense logically under mutual destruction to remind the other side you have nuclear weapons. That is a deterrent. I can see how it's a deterrent. It's like, careful what you're doing because we have nuclear weapons, and therefore, you wouldn't be able to attack us because we would attack you, so it's a deterrent. But the thing is, when you escalate these things, there is a danger they can get out of control and generals start to mobilise and start to get ideas, and there's, it just feels like you get closer to some sort of doomsday situation the more you bring these things into play, even if you're bringing them into play as a deterrent, because they are ultimately weapons that can destroy the world. I suspect it was a lot more of the psyche of the West, in the EU, in the United States, in like the 70s and 80s, about the prospect of a nuclear war. And I suspect also that the reason why I don't have that much affinity is because I was born after the fall of the Soviet Union, where that, there was general talks about decommissioning nuclear stockpiles and denuclearization, multiple treaties that were being signed. But this, if you're watching and you were, if you remember those times in the 70s and 80s, I imagine you were more accustomed to that kind of acceptance that ultimately there are powers at play that could, drop a bomb on your head. I don't know. Again, I'm speculating. James Tree, but I really can't see Putin reacting with nukes. Yeah, but it's just this danger that when you put things into play, when you put things on the chessboard, there's a danger that things get out of control and or mistakes are made. Human beings will always make mistakes. Like, if you ask me to do something 1,000 times, a couple of times I'll probably make a mistake, no matter what it is, no matter how basic the task. And so, there are these chain of commands and processes that are designed to eliminate human error, but Stephen, it's great sociology and psychological case study to see the language and escalation of dictators. I feel like this, although there's this terrible war being waged at the moment in Ukraine, at this incredible human cost, especially when we look at the reported Russian casualties, that probably a bit embellished, but really it's like never before this laser focus on the psychology of one person in the world, which is Vladimir Putin. Like, what is he thinking? Why is he doing certain things? It really is psychology. And then you've also got psychology of the Russian troops conducting the invasion, the Ukrainian forces defending. Ultimately, a lot of it is still coming down to psychology. We have all these fancy structures in play, like the United Nations and organisations like WTO and the EU framework and government processes, but ultimately this is still coming down. It seems the psychology of one person, which is really, if you think like that, I find it quite shocking. NBI in the 80s, it was just known that Russia had a lot of nukes and the US was making more. I don't know if anyone does anyone watching remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? Is it in anyone's memory what it felt like at that time? Private jet going from Latvia to Moscow. That would be interesting. So I think that airspace is meant to be closed, but let's see. Latvia obviously being in the EU. Show me for, of course no one remembers. Why would there be no one who remembers? I don't know. Sarah, the general who didn't report the threat, that was actually a realistic drill, saved lives. Yeah, save lives is arguably a bit of an understatement. Oh, that is interesting. Allegedly, well, this plane is taken off from St. Petersburg and it is flying over Estonia and Latvia, so that is very unusual. I don't know if anyone can see any reporting over that plane, but I had thought that this airspace was closed even to kind of private jets, but maybe it's not an inverted Russian plane. It's flying at a very high altitude, isn't it? It's flying at a higher altitude than a lot of the commercial airliners around here. What is going on over here? That's not flying, that's not a Russian plane, so... Could be the American embassy staff, perhaps. It's a bombardier plane. So they don't really make any particularly large aircraft. To understand it. It's 43,000 now. I think it was 47 before, so maybe it seems unusual. I don't know. That flight path at the moment is a very unusual flight path out from St. Petersburg. May not be a plane. It says here Bombardier Global Express, Bombardier. They make planes and trains and other things. Interesting to see where it goes if it keeps transponder on. I'm going to get a subscription to Flight Radar, by the way. Flight Radar. So tomorrow I'll have a subscription to Flight Radar. To repair. TB land that one in the private jet with both in the same flight, so I'd say maybe it is a diplomatic plane. You don't need a subscription, but you know, I'm very lucky that people are donating, so I will, you know, everyone who donates on my sim racing streams, that's the reason why the reason why I have this channel. You know, I remember streaming a couple of years ago to 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, and very lucky to have an incredible community. So a lot of the mods you see are people from that community, and you're very lucky to have people supporting through memberships and donations. And on my other streams I have ads as well, buying my steering wheel, monitors, 3 monitors here, light, microphone, mixer, stream deck. Sim rig was given to me by a sponsor. A lot of other stuff, PS5, Xbox, all this stuff is made possible by that. And just so happened I'm at a position where I'm used to streaming to hundreds of people, and I'm used to sitting in this sim rig looking at these screens, not weirdly going to the bathroom or getting fatigued, too fatigued, or getting eye fatigue. So right, did we just lose that plane? Maybe we did. Maybe it turned transponder off as it goes over the Baltic Sea here. Ian Kemp saying it's Italian transponder. I understand the Italians were a little bit reluctant to go full on board with the sanctions because they were worried about sales of high-value Italian goods to high net worth Russian individuals, like Italian fashion and stuff like that. Sorry, Vladimir Putin, if you want to come in this chat, you've got to speak English. It's going to Frankfurt, okay. Possibly a diplomatic plane. I don't know if anyone has seen this being reported elsewhere as well. I haven't heard that, Uluk. Slow, you don't need to pay, just build a radar and supply data. Nice. Yeah, I think it's been pretty much confirmed now that that Antonov plane has been destroyed or heavily damaged. I think it was on fire in satellite photos. We thought that might have happened on the first day. We were speculating, and I didn't hear about it again until today. I think the Twitter account for Ukraine tweeted about it. We showed a video of it actually on the first day we did the stream. The main reason why it's subscriber only chat is because that's what I have on all my other streams, and it stops a lot of spam. We talked a lot about that previously on the channel. Yeah, the Gran Turismo 7 content, I mean, again, the Gran Turismo 7 videos I make do get more views than these streams, so I don't think I'm doing this in a cynical way, but maybe I am. But I would be getting more views and subscribers doing the Gran Turismo 7 stuff. But maybe I don't know. Maybe this is something I could do. I have no idea. Everything is happening so fast. My desire to do this on the first day was just that I felt like we had I asked the mods and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing this stream. Would you be happy to mod it?" And the mods were like, "Yeah, we think it's important as well. Let's do it." Because in my Discord, we don't talk about politics or these kind of world events. It is purely sim racing, so we didn't have that space. Let me check out that plane. If anyone does have any other streams they recommend, then put those titles in the chat so people can know about those and go there and subscribe to those streams. Yeah, this is a Globemaster. This isn't a refueling plane. This is a transport plane. And this is an RAF plane from Bryce Norton. Presumably you're going to land pretty quickly. I know there's the Polish Air Force have a base in Lublin. It is at 18,000 feet, so we'll keep an eye on this. Presumably it's going to land pretty soon. There's a UK flight over Russia. Do let me know the number if you got it. It definitely feels like a quieter night in Ukraine than the last few days. Let me just refresh these sources here. And I think there's also a media blackout. There's some reported footage about fighter jets taking off from Belarus. I can't really make it out. Could be a lot of things. Thanks, Ian. Can't, unless I've put in, I can't find it, I'm afraid. Free to say one extreme PC game. I'm all about just having different opinions, and it's important for me to know that if you have that viewpoint, if people have that viewpoint, that's important for me to know. So I'm not deleting comments. Hugo, people are not taking into account that the possibility that Putin is not in his right mind. I definitely had not. I was always trying to apply a rational kind of framework to explain the decisions here. I do still think it's too early to say whether this is going to plan for Russia or not, because you could imagine that the way this is going to be reported by allies of Ukraine is going to be in a way to, support the Ukrainian forces in terms of morale, etc. But the fact that until recently the Russian press was saying there were no reported casualties is obviously a red flag. But having watched Russian state TV, that is the way they kind of operate. It's almost like there's a fog of war in the way that things are reported, whereas there's a lot of embedded reporters with Ukrainian troops. Has that thermobaric blast been confirmed as fake? I don't think it would be a thermobaric blast. I think it would be a fuel depot or something like that exploding. I think that's much bigger than you would expect a one of these tactical thermobaric weapons. Titan on-sea war leaks is a great channel later on Ukrainian, just beware. Okay, I don't know about that one. Martin, Russia has an operational pause. It could be if there are negotiations going on by a Ukrainian delegation and a Russian delegation, it could be that one side, you would suspect Ukraine, but one side has said, hey, we're going to walk away from these talks unless a ceasefire is implemented. But I feel like a ceasefire would be reported. But again, there looks to be a general blackout. Okay, what is weird is that it feels like things are getting better, but it also doesn't seem to be wrapping up. Yeah, we asked recently what people's thoughts were, and today compared to a few days ago, and it was a bit mixed. I definitely feel not as much on edge. I guess it was much more shocking and raw a few days ago, whereas with the passage of time, it becomes more accepted. And I don't know how that's going to continue. Is it just going to become more accepted in like the Western civilian psyche that, oh yeah, Ukraine is a war zone? Is that just going to be, you know, a bit like a lot of people might think, oh, Syria is a war zone? I don't know. Yeah, I've seen reports about whether it's a missile or planes from Belarus. There's reports like it seems very unusual, because something I did read that was widely reported is that as a, you know, whilst the negotiations were ongoing, Belarus would not launch anything or permit Russia to put any further troops in, which you would see. I think it was presented as a win for Ukraine. Darren, China has come out condemning Putin. I've seen mixed reports on that. The statement of the Security Council was very strange from the Chinese delegate, but that's how the Security Council works, United Nations. It's all very pre-prepared. Bear with me. What's my opinion on the situation at ISS? It's one of these things where it's almost so not relevant, but it's just you know, that's no nostalgia there, but it's just a factual reality that the ISS is one of these rare examples of where there is really intense Western and Russian cooperation. So what happens to it, I don't know. It was getting near the end of life anyway, so it may just be decommissioned sooner. Another example kind of is Chernobyl, that, you know, there would have been a lot of international scientists there, I imagine, and they're probably still conducting their overseeing of the decommissioning, but they're being guarded by Russian troops. There was some dispute about some photos. I think the Russians said that there's a joint security operation at Chernobyl, so Ukrainian and Russian forces, but it looked like some of the images there may have been faked, or there were some people standing in, you could see reflections of some people in windows, etc. YouTube channel called Whack Milk has multiple countries, okay. Yeah, Elon did say Starlink's now free in Ukraine, but that doesn't mean anything unless you have a specific bit of kit. So a little bit symbolic, but again, I think maybe symbolic gestures are also really important right now. That Global Express plane had a 4507. Has it? Where is it? It's going. Might be landing here. I believe there's an airport here. This might be supplies. This might be supplies landing here, and then going to be handed over to Ukraine here and delivered across. So there's a very high likelihood, I would say, that these could be some form of supplies. This is a transport plane. This is not a tanker. But again, that is pure speculation. Yeah, thanks, Lodo. We're going to end this. Oh, it's 1 o'clock. It's 1 o'clock. So I'm going to end this stream. If you have any other streams you recommend to people, then put them in the chat now, so people can go there. If you are on Twitter, I would appreciate if you have any thoughts on the thread I posted on Twitter. Let me post a link right now in the chat. So I basically put together a thread of... Whoa, that was a big explosion. Let me know your thoughts on that tweet. Let me pick it, that thread. I wanted to kind of like crystallize or record how I felt at some point today. I think I had a quick nap and then I woke up and was like, I want to record how I felt. Nemiko Network had a good stream. WC Whack Milk is an okay stream. I'm really sorry I have to I have to be very strict and I have to go to bed because I have to wake up and go to work. We'll be back on tomorrow. We'll try and do about 10 PM every day, a couple of hours. This is a difficult thing about, you know, for a lot of people it's been the weekend and now we're going back into the working week and we have to do our jobs even though there's war is raging, and this is an important psychological stuff for us in terms of switching off. And yeah, no doubt we're all going to be following it, but whatever happens in terms of how we follow this and how things progress, I think everyone who's watching, over 1,000 people watching or been watching the other streams, I think it's been very special, the kind of community that we have here, to just think about these things. And these questions don't really get actually now I think about it, I don't think these questions really get asked anywhere else. So you can't watch news anywhere else and ask the reporter a question. Well, I'm not saying I'm a reporter, but you can't ask questions and have a discussion about things. It's very much a one way thing, and this is completely the opposite. This is a community and discussion. So did not expect to be doing this. A lot of people told me not to do it because you shouldn't talk about politics and stuff like that, and my channel is about sim racing. And I have got a lot of comments from people saying, hey, I thought this was a sim racing channel, I don't care about politics, to stop doing this. So I've got to work all this out, but I've committed that, yeah, this week we're going to do a couple of hours every night, and I just need to think about how I kind of structure that on the channel. But definitely on Twitter I posted this thread, and it would be great to get your thoughts. Yeah, thank you so much everyone. I hope again it's been a positive stream. I really hope that things felt, if things felt really bad a couple of days ago, although we're hearing explosions now, it may feel more positive in terms of Kyiv. You know, there hasn't been heavy bloodshed in Kyiv. There are negotiations going on right now. The West has been very united in its support. What's going to happen next? We literally don't know. No one can tell you what's going to happen next. We can think about his options. But yeah, thank you so much everyone. I really appreciate your support as well. I'm not an expert on this stuff. All I know is I know how to stream and chat, etc. But I'm going to be going to sleep now, and I will see you again next time. I don't think it's appropriate to play my credits, really, is it? I'll tell you what I'm going to do, just to show you how my streams normally are, I'm going to play my normal credits, my normal outro. This is all sim racing, so I'll see you next time. Stay safe, stay positive, and you got any questions, bring them back next time, we'll talk about them.
There was a wild ride, I know at the start you were curious, but my goodness, that was fast and furious. All the intensity we had, we've come to the end, now that's too bad. But the energy threw books off the shelf, and we hope you all enjoyed yourselves. Enjoy yourselves. We will go all the way, it's not about the trend. Keep going now, keep going till we reach the end. Till we reach the end. If you had a good time being part of this journey, and the thrill is now making you thirsty, if you want to keep seeing the action, then just just drop us a like so you can come back for more. If you're new here, we welcome you with a smile. If you like what you saw, just hit subscribe. We appreciate each and every one of you tuning in to see a red card. Join us for the next part. Hope to see you again soon.